was overhead. Came two young lovers lately wed. I'm half sick of shadows, she said, the Lady of Shalott.
It was raining so hard that Mark stayed in the Range Rover, drinking cold espresso straight from the flask and listening to a play on the radio about a widow who compulsively knitted cardigans for her recently dead husband. He was thinking about calling it a day when he saw Katie trudging across the field toward him. "You look drowned," he called out. "Why don't you pack it in?" "We found something really exciting, that's why." She pulled back her hood. Her curly blonde hair was stuck to her forehead, and there was a drip on the end of her nose. "Where's Nigel?" he asked her. "He's still there, digging." "I told him to survey the ditches. What the hell's he digging for?" "Mark, we think we may have found Shalott." "What? What are you talking about?" Katie wiped the rain from her face. "Well, those ditches aren't ditches. There used to be a stream, and there's an island in the middle. And those lumps that we thought were Iron Age sheep pens, they're stones, all cut and dressed like the stones for building a wall." "Oh, I see," said Mark. "And you and Nigel, you immediately thought Shalott." "It's not just the stones, Mark. We found some kind of metal frame. It's big and it's very tarnished. Well, Nigel thinks it could be a mirror." "I get it. Island, Camelot, mirror, must be Shalott." "Come and have a look anyway." Mark checked his watch. "Let's leave it till tomorrow. We can't do anything sensible in this weather." Katie said, "Please, Mark." Mark was the boss, and Katie was only a second-year history student hired for the Easter holidays, but he had already discovered how persistent she could be. "Okay," he said. "If I must." Katie started back up the hill. "Think of it! Shalott!" Mark caught up with her. "Forget it, Katie. It's all stories, especially the Lady of Shalott. A cursed woman in a castle, dying of unrequited love. Sounds like my ex, come to think of it." They topped the ridge. "You see," Katie persisted, "the island, the river, it's just as Tennyson described it." "It isn't Shalott, Katie. Even if it were, it's situated slap bang in the middle of the proposed route for the Woolston Relief Road, which is already 3 years late and £6 million over budget, which means that the county council will have to rethink their entire highways building plan, and we won't get paid until the whole mess has gone through a full-scale public inquiry, which probably means in 15 years' time." "But think of it," said Katie. "There, where Nigel's digging, that could be the island where the castle used to stand, where the Lady of Shalott weaved her tapestries. And that ditch was the river where she floated down to Camelot in her boat, singing her last sad lament before she died. If any of that is true, sweetheart, then this is the hill where Historic Site Assessment plc went instantly bankrupt. But we'd be famous, wouldn't we?" "No, we wouldn't. You don't think for one moment that we'd be allowed to dig it up, do you? You and Nigel are still students, and I wouldn't recognise a barrow if I tripped over one. Besides, we don't get paid to find sites of outstanding archaeological significance. We get paid not to find them. Bronze Age buckle, shove it in your pocket and rediscover it 5 miles away, well away from the proposed new supermarket site. An Iron Age sheep pen, fine. We can call in a JCB and have it shifted to the Ancient Britain display at Frome. But not Shalott, Katie. Shalott would sink us." As they came panting up the side of the ditch, Nigel stood up and took off his helmet. Nigel had tight curly hair, bright red cheeks and a fresh, simple face, like a hobbit. But Mark hadn't employed him for his Middle-earth looks. He had employed him because he was reading archaeology and landscape at Essex University, and Mark could boast that Historic Site Assessment plc was fully staffed by leading experts in their field. "Nigel, how's it going? Katie tells me you found Shalott." "Well, no, Mark. I don't like to jump to hasty conclusions, but these stones, look." Nigel was circling around the grassy tussocks, flapping his hands. "I've cut back some of the turf, you see, and underneath, well, see? Bath stone. And look at that jading. Late 13th century, I'd say." "And you think this is Shalott?" Nigel looked around the meadow, blinking. "The location suggests it more than anything else. There was certainly a tower here. You don't use stones 5 feet thick to build a single-story pigsty, do you? But why would anyone build a tower here, in the middle of a valley?" "I don't know, you tell me." "You'd only build a tower here as a folly, or to keep somebody imprisoned." "Like the Lady of Shalott." "Well, exactly. So if there was a tower here, where's the rest of it?" "Oh, robbed out most likely over the years. At a very rough estimate, it was built just before 1275, and most likely abandoned during the Black Death around 1340. "Oh, yes." Mark was already trying to work out what equipment they were going to need to shift these stones and where they could discreetly dump them. Nigel pointed to a stone that was still half buried in grass. There were some deep marks chiselled into it. "Look, you can just make out a cross, and part of a skull, and the letters DSPM. Now that's an acronym for medieval Latin meaning, God save us from the pestilence within these walls. So whoever lived in this tower, they could have been infected with the Black Death. Well, that's the most obvious assumption, yes." "Isn't it exciting?" Mark looked around. He couldn't decide which he hated more, archaeology or rain. "Katie said you'd found some metal thing." "Well, yeah, now that's the clincher." Nigel strode back to the place where he'd been digging. Barely visible in the mud was a length of blackened metal, about 1.5 meters long and curved at both ends. "It's a fire guard, isn't it?" said Mark. Nigel had cleaned a part of it, and he could see that there were flowers embossed on it, and bunches of grapes and vine tendrils. In the centre of it was a lump that looked like a human face, although it was so encrusted with mud that it was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. Mark peered at it closely. "An old Victorian fire guard, that's all." "I don't think so," said Nigel. "I think it's the top edge of a mirror, and a 13th century mirror at that." "Nigel, a mirror? As big as that in 1275? They didn't have glass mirrors in those days, remember? This would have to be solid silver, or silver-plated at least." "Exactly," said Nigel. "A solid silver mirror 5 feet across, and the Lady of Shalott had a mirror, didn't she? Not for looking at herself, but for looking at the world outside, so that she could weave a tapestry of life in Camelot without having to look at it directly. There she weaves, by night and day, a magic web with colours gay. She has heard a whisper say a curse is on her if she stay to look down to Camelot. But moving through a mirror clear, that hangs before her all the year, shadows of the world appear." And Katie joined in. "And in her web she still delights to weave the mirror's magic sights." "Top of the class," said Mark. "Now, how long do you think it's going to take to dig this out?" "Oh, several weeks," said Nigel. "Months, even. We don't want to damage it, do we? We need to fence this area off, don't we? Inform the police and the British Museum?" Mark said, "No, Nigel, we don't." Nigel slowly stood up, blinking. "Mark, we have to. This tower, this mirror, they could change the entire concept of Arthurian legend. They're archaeological proof that the Lady of Shalott wasn't just a story and that Camelot really was here." "Nigel, that's a wonderful notion, but it's not going to pay off our overdraft, is it?" Katie said, I don't understand. If this is the Lady of Shalott's mirror, and it's genuine, it could be worth millions." "It could, yes, but not to us. Treasure Trove belongs to Her Majesty's government. Not only that, this isn't our land, and we're working under contract for the county council, so our chances of getting a share of it are just about 0. Nigel stared at him. "You want us to bury it again, and forget we ever found it?" "We can't do that." "Oh, no," Mark told him. He pointed to the perforated vines in the top of the frame. "We could run a couple of chains through here, though, couldn't we, and use the Range Rover to pull it out?" "What? That could cause irreparable damage." "Nigel, everything that happens in this world causes irreparable damage. That's the whole definition of history." Katie came up to them. "I hate to say it, Mark, but I think you're right. We found this tower. We found this mirror. If we report it, we'll get nothing at all. No money, no credit, not even a mention in the papers. Nigel stood over the metal frame for a long time, frowning. "Well?" Mark asked him at last. It was already growing dark, and a chilly mist was creeping across the Rhines. "All right then, bugger it," said Nigel. "Let's pull the bugger out." Mark drove the Range Rover across the meadow until he reached the island of Shalott. He switched on all the floodlights, front and rear, and then he and Nigel fastened towing chains to the metal frame, wrapping them in torn T-shirts to protect the mouldings as much as they could. Mark slowly revved the Range Rover forward, its tires spinning in the fibrous brown mud. Nigel screamed, "Steady! Steady!" like a panicky hockey mistress. It was dark by the time they had managed to pull the mirror out. They hunkered down beside it and shone their flashlights on it. The decorative vine tendrils had been badly bent by the towing chains, but there was no other obvious damage. The surface of the mirror was black and mottled, like a serious bruise, but otherwise it seemed to have survived its 700 years with very little corrosion. It was over 3 centimeters thick, and it was so heavy that they could barely lift it. "What do we do now?" asked Katie. "We clean it up. Then we talk to 1 or 2 dealers, see how much we can get for it." "But what about Shalott?" asked Nigel. "This island, it's all going to be lost." "That's the story of Britain, Nigel. Nothing you can do to change it." They heaved the mirror into the back of the Range Rover and drove back to Wincanton. Mark had rented a small end-of-terrace house on the outskirts because it was much cheaper than staying in a hotel for 7 weeks. The house was plain, flat-fronted, and painted a dirty pink. In the back garden stood a single, naked cherry tree. Between them, grunting, they manoeuvred the mirror into the living room and propped it against the wall. "I feel like a criminal," said Nigel. Mark lit the gas fire and briskly chafed his hands. "You shouldn't. You should feel like an Englishman protecting his heritage." That evening Mark ordered a takeaway curry from the Wincanton Tandoori in the High Street, and they ate chicken madras and mushroom bhaji while they took it in turns to clean away 7 centuries of tarnish. Katie stood on a kitchen chair and cleaned all of the decorative detail at the top of the frame with a toothbrush and cotton buds. As she worried the mud out of the human head in the centre of the mirror, it gradually emerged as a woman, with high cheekbones and slanted eyes, and her hair looped up in elaborate braids. Underneath her chin there was a scroll with the single word, Lamia. "Lamia," said Nigel. "That's a Greek name for Lilith. It was Adam's first companion before Eve. She demanded the same rights as Adam, so God banished her from Eden. She married a demon, became the queen of the demons." He touched the woman's faintly smiling lips. Lamia was supposed to be the most incredibly irresistible woman you can imagine. Just one night with Lamia, and poof, you'd never look at a human woman again. What was the catch? She sucked all the blood out of you, that's all. You're talking about my ex again. Katie said, "John Keats wrote a poem called Lamia, didn't he?" "That's right," said Nigel. "A chap called Lysias met Lamia, fell madly in love with her. Trouble is, he didn't realise she was cursed by God, some penanced lady elf, some demon's mistress, or the demon's self." "Cursed?" said Katie. "Like the Lady of Shalott? Perhaps they were one and the same person." There was no question that the woman's face on the mirror was beautiful, but it had a slyness about it too. "Lamia was a bit of a mystery, really," said Nigel. "She was a blood-sucking enchantress, but she was capable of deep and genuine love. Lysias said she gave him 100 thirsts." "Just like this chicken madras," said Mark. "There any more beer in the fridge?" Mark slept badly that night. He dreamt that he was walking at the rear of a long funeral procession with a horse-drawn hearse. A woman's voice was calling him from very far away. He stopped, while the funeral procession carried on. "Mark!" she kept calling him. "Mark!" He woke up. It was still dark, although his travel clock said 7:26. "Mark!" she screamed. It was Katie, calling him from downstairs, and her voice was filled with panic. He rolled out of bed, still stunned from sleeping, and stumbled down the narrow staircase. In the living room the curtains were drawn back, although the grey November day was still dark and it was raining. Katie was standing in the middle of the room in her pink cotton nightshirt, her hair standing up like a fright wig. "Katie, what the hell's going on?" "It's Nigel. I called him, but he didn't answer. Mark, he's all wet. Something's happened to him." Mark switched on the overhead light. At first he couldn't understand what he was looking at, but then Katie made an extraordinary mewling noise, and he realized that he was looking at Nigel. Nigel was lying on his back on the couch, wearing nothing but green woolen socks and faded blue underpants. He was staring up at the ceiling, wide-eyed, his mouth stretched wide open as if he were shouting at somebody. There was no doubt that he was dead. His throat had been torn open in a stringy red mess of tendons and cartilage, and the cushion beneath his head was soaked black with blood. "Jesus," said Mark. He leaned against the door jamb to steady himself and took 3 or 4 very deep breaths. "Jesus." Katie was hysterical. "What's happened to him? Mark, what's happened to him?" "I don't know. I just don't know." "What if it's Dog? It must still be in here, somewhere." Mark led her through to the kitchen and rattled the back door handle to show her that it was still secure. "I locked it myself last night. Whatever it was, it isn't here anymore. Wait there, I'll have to call the police." He had left his phone on the blood-spattered coffee table next to Nigel's body. He stepped cautiously around the couch and picked it up. He couldn't take his eyes off Nigel's face. The strange thing was, Nigel didn't look terrified. In fact, he looked almost exultant, as if having his throat ripped out had been the most thrilling experience of his whole life. Katie came through from the kitchen and stood in the doorway. She looked calmer now, although she was still trembling and her face was as white as wax. "Have you called them?" she asked him. "I'm just about to." "Mark, what do you really think it was?" Mark's finger was poised over his phone, but he hesitated. "I can't imagine, but there's nobody else in this house, is there, apart from us? I hope the police won't think—" And he suddenly thought about something else, too. The questions that the police would ask them about the mirror. Technically, they had stolen it. An ancient relic worth millions. So what would Nigel's death look like at first sight but a falling out amongst thieves? He lifted his hands, and there was blood on them from his phone. "Look," said Katie very quietly. Mark frowned down at the worn beige carpet. There was a trail of blotchy bloodstains leading from the side of the couch to the centre of the room. At first sight he had taken them for random spatters, but now he could see that they were footprints. Not Nigel's footprints, though. They were far too small, and there was no blood on Nigel's socks. Close to the coffee table the footprints formed a pattern like a huge petal-shedding rose, and then, much fainter, they made their way toward the mirror, where they stopped. Katie looked all around the room, frowning, and then she approached the mirror and peered into the shiny circle that she had cleaned yesterday evening. "It's... No. No what? It's almost as if someone killed Nigel and then walked across the room and into the mirror." "That's insane. People can't walk into mirrors." "But these footprints, they don't go anywhere else, do they?" They both looked up at the face of Lamia. She looked back at them, secret and serene. Her smile seemed to say, "Wouldn't you like to know?" "They built a tower, didn't they?" said Katie. "They built a tower to keep the Lady of Shalott locked up. If she was Lamia, then they locked her up because she seduced men and drank their blood." "Katie, that was 700 years ago. That's if it really happened at all." Katie pointed to Nigel's body on the couch. "Nigel is dead, Mark. That really happened. But nobody could have entered this house last night, could they? Not without breaking the door down and waking us up. Nobody could have entered this room unless they stepped right out of this mirror." "So what do we tell the police?" "We tell them the truth, that's all." "And you think they're going to believe us?" "Well, officer, it was like this. We took a 13th century mirror that didn't belong to us, and the Lady of Shalott came out of it in the middle of the night and tore Nigel's throat out. They'll send us to Broadmoor, Katie. They'll put us in the funny farm for life." "Mark, listen. This is real. And these footprints, they prove it. It's only a story, Katie. It's only a legend. But think of the poem, The Lady of Shalott. Think of what it says. Moving through a mirror clear that hangs before her all the year, shadows of the world appear. Oh, don't you get it? Tennyson specifically wrote through a mirror, not in it, through it. The Lady of Shalott wasn't looking at her mirror, she was inside it, looking out. Oh, this gets better. But it all fits together. She was Lamia, a bloodsucker, a vampire. She could only come out at night. But she didn't hide inside a coffin all day. She hid inside a mirror. Daylight can't penetrate a mirror any more than it can penetrate a closed coffin. I don't know much about vampires, Katie, but I do know that you can't see them in mirrors. And that's the reason why. Lamia and her reflection are one and the same. When she steps out of the mirror, she's no longer inside it, so she doesn't appear to have a reflection. Katie, for God's sake, you're getting completely carried away. But it's the only answer that makes any sense. Why did they lock up the Lady of Shalott on an island, in a stream? Because vampires can't cross running water. Why did they carve a crucifix and a skull on the stones outside? The words said, God save us from the pestilence within these walls. They didn't mean the Black Death. They meant her, the Lady of Shalott, Lamia. She was the pestilence. Mark sat down. So, he asked Katie at last, what do you think we ought to do? Let's draw the curtains, she said. Let's shut out all the daylight. If you sit here, perhaps she'll be tempted to come out again. After all, she's been 700 years without fresh blood, hasn't she? She must be thirsty. Mark stared at her. You're having a laugh, aren't you? You want me to sit here, in the dark, hoping that some mythical woman's going to step out of a dirty old mirror and try to suck all the blood out of me? It will prove what happened to Nigel, won't it? It will prove that the Lady of Shalott was real, especially if we can stop her from going back into the mirror. Katie, this is nonsense! But Nigel was lying on the couch, silently shouting at the ceiling, and there was so much blood and so many footprints. Katie raised both hands in surrender. If you think I'm being ridiculous, let's forget it. Let's just call the police and tell them exactly what happened. I'm sure the forensics will prove that we didn't kill him. Mark stood up again and went over to the mirror. He peered into the polished circle, but all he could see was his own face, dimly haloed. Nigel's death had shaken him to the core, and he had a terrible cold suspicion that Katie might be right, and that something had emerged from the mirror. But if he didn't encourage it to come out, how was he going to explain Nigel's body to the police? And what was he going to do with the mirror? Okay, then, he said, still staring at his own reflection. You're the Camelot expert. If that's what you want to do, let's do it. Katie drew the brown velvet curtains and tucked them in at the bottom to keep out the tiniest chink of daylight. Mark pulled one of the armchairs up in front of the mirror and sat facing it. I feel like one of those goats they tie up to catch tigers. Well, I wouldn't worry. I'm probably wrong. Mark took out a crumpled Kleenex and blew his nose, and then sniffed and said, God! That's the blood, said Katie, adding after a moment, My uncle used to be a butcher. He always said that bad blood is the worst smell in the world. They sat in silence for a while. The smell of blood seemed to be steadily growing thicker and riper, so that Mark could actually taste it. I think I can see something, said Katie. What? Where? Look at the mirror. In the middle, like a very faint light. Mark stared toward the mirror in the darkness. At first he couldn't see anything but overwhelming blackness, but then he saw a flicker, like somebody waving a white scarf, and then another. Very gradually, a face began to appear in the polished circle. Mark felt a slow, crawling sensation down his back, and his lower jaw began to judder so much that he had to clench his teeth to stop it. The face was pale and bland, but strangely beautiful, and it was staring straight at him, unblinking, and smiling. It looked more like the face of a marble statue than a human being. Mark tried to look away, but he couldn't. Every time he turned his head toward Katie, he was compelled to turn back again. The darkened living room seemed to grow even more airless and suffocating, and when he said, "Katie, can you see her?" his voice was muffled, as if he had a pillow over his face. Soundlessly, the pale woman took one step out of the surface of the mirror. She was naked, and her skin was the colour of the moon. The black tarnish clung to her for a moment like oily cobwebs, but as she took another step forward, they slid away from her, leaving her luminous and pristine. Mark could do nothing but stare at her. She came closer and closer, until he could have reached up and touched her. She had a high forehead, and her hair was braided in strange, elaborate loops. She had no eyebrows, which made her face expressionless, but her eyes were extraordinary. Her eyes were like looking at death. She raised her right hand and lightly kissed her fingertips. He could feel her aura, both electrical and freezing cold, as if somebody had left the fridge door wide open. She whispered something, but it sounded more French than English, very soft and elided, and he could only understand a few words of it. "My sweet love," she said, "come to me, give me your very life." There were dried runnels of blood on her breasts, and down her slightly bulging stomach and down her thighs. Her feet were spattered in blood too. Mark looked up at her, and he couldn't think what to say or what to do. He felt as if all of the energy had drained out of him and he couldn't even speak. We all have to die one day, he thought. But to die now, today, in this naked woman's arms, what an adventure that would be. "Mark!" shouted Katie. "Grab her, Mark! Hold on to her!" The woman twisted around and hissed at Katie as furiously as a snake. Mark heaved himself out of his chair and tried to seize the woman's arm, but she was cold and slippery like half-melted ice, and her wrist slithered out of his grasp. "Now, Katie!" he yelled at her. Katie threw herself at the curtains and dragged them down, the curtain hooks popping like firecrackers. The woman went for her, and she had almost reached the window when the last curtain hook popped, and the living room was drowned with grey, drained daylight. She whipped around again and stared at Mark, and the expression on her face almost stopped his heart. "Of all men," she whispered, "you have been most faithless, and you will be punished." Katie was on her knees, struggling to free herself from the curtains. The woman seized Katie's curls, lifted her up, and bit into her neck with an audible crunch. Katie didn't even scream. She stared at Mark in mute desperation and fell sideways onto the carpet with blood jetting out of her neck and spraying across the furniture. The woman came slowly toward him, and Mark took one step back, and then another, shifting the armchair so that it stood between them. But she stopped. Her skin was already shining as if it were melting, and she closed her eyes. Mark waited, holding his breath. Katie was convulsing, one foot jerking against the leg of the coffee table so that the empty beer cans rattled together. The woman opened her eyes and gave Mark one last, unreadable look. Then she turned back toward the mirror. She took 3 paces, and it swallowed her, like an oil-streaked pool of water. Mark waited, and waited, not moving. After a while, he sat down. He thought of calling the police, but what could he tell them? Then he thought of tying the bodies to the mirror and dropping them into a Rhine where they would never be found. But the police would come anyway, wouldn't they? Asking questions. The day slowly went by. Just after 2 o'clock, the clouds cleared for a moment, and the naked cherry tree in the back garden sparkled with sunlight. At 3:30, a loud clatter in the hallway made him jump, but it was only an old woman with a shopping trolley pushing a copy of the Wincanton Advertiser through the letterbox. And so the darkness gradually gathered, and Mark sat in his armchair in front of the mirror, waiting. At 5:30, when the room was completely filled with shadows, He thought he saw a faint pale stirring in the surface of the mirror, like a fish in the bottom of a murky pond. He gripped the arms of his chair, his heart beating so hard that it hurt his ribs. Then he heard a bubbling groan from the couch, and the beer cans started to rattle. The silvery-faced woman appeared in the mirror, and as she did so, Nigel and Katie sat up to greet her. "I am half sick of shadows," said the Lady of Shalott. Jamie Bamber was reading Half Sick of Shadows, written by Graham Masterton. It was produced by Anne Kelly.